Valentine's Day is just around the corner. A time when the topic of conversation for lovers young and old turns to things like romantic getaways, lavish gifts, and of course, how are you going to pay for all of it? So maybe finances aren't the most romantic talking point. But in every relationship, it's a subject that, like it or not, always comes up one way or another, even if we'd rather it didn't.
We don't have these conversations very often, so for most of us, we've never talked about this. So these are touchy conversations.
That's our guest today, life transition expert, speaker, coach, and consultant for Scotiabank and the Scotiabank Women Initiative, Dr. Amy Dupree.
You know, what we want is to have a healthy relationship with money. We want to be able to, when we spend money, feel like it's okay and we're taking care of the future at the same time. And that's a balancing act. And it's not something that's just innate in a couple to be able to do. You have to really figure that out together.
So Amy is here with some practical advice on how to talk with your partner about money. She has tips and conversation starters so you can have productive discussions on the subject, whether you're still playing the field, a newlywed, or trying to balance paying for your kids' education and caring for an elderly parent.
Because I think if we do money conversations well as a couple, that tends to spill over into other important life conversations we need to have. Doing this well, it'll help in every disagreement you have as a couple. Not that I have any experience in this, of course. But
Oh, of course, me neither. I'm Stephen Maurice, and this is Perspectives. Amy, it's great to see you again. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Really happy to be here again.
So we are going to be talking today about how to approach conversations with spouses or partners to talk about money. We'll jump right into it. What are the top issues that you hear about from couples when it comes to talking about money?
I think one of the biggest issues we see with couples is that they have a different approach to money. And what I mean about that is you have someone who's a saver, you have someone who's a spender,
Right.
and we seem to find each other. So that we need to have these conversations for the rest of our lives. But you can see where that can be an issue. It becomes a problem for a lot of couples to have to navigate, a not unusual problem. Another issue that I see with couples really goes to life goals. When we talk about money, we have to connect money and life. Money's not a standalone issue.
Right.
So when people think about their financial goals, what they really mean are their life goals. And so maybe one person in the couple is focused on buying the bigger house, and then you have someone else who's thinking about retirement, and they haven't come together on those life goals. So that can be a problem. And, you know, Stephen, I think of a third one as we're talking, which has to do with kids and how much financial support do you give your kids at every life stage. So it can be when they're young, how much do you give your kids for spending money all the way through? Do you pay for their university? How much support do you give them when they're in their early adult years? All of those are issues couples sometimes struggle with.
Right. So money is not a standalone issue. It affects so many different parts of your life.
That's right. I think that's one of the key messages that people need to realize, because I think they think about money as, well, that's over here on one side and the rest of my life is over here on the other side.
Right.
And that's just not true. It's integrated.
Right. And it's also something a lot of people just don't like to talk about. But we'll get into all those details. I just wanted to ask, is something like the sandwich generation, maybe you can describe what that is, but is that something that adds to the stress of managing and talking about money within a couple?
I think we see different life stages where these money conversations have unique challenges. And you mentioned sandwich generation, and we talk about sandwich generation as people caring for their children and also caring for their aging parents or their in-laws. So I bet you can see where now there's some issues that come up. I already mentioned that people may have different views about how much money to give their kids. But when parents or in-laws need care, there are lots of expenses related to that.
For sure.
And we know that caregivers often end up paying for some of those things for their parents' care. And then there are kind of hidden costs, things like you live far away from your parents or in-laws and you have to travel. So you have travel costs. Or perhaps you've had a reduction in your income because you decided not to take the promotion or you went part-time because you're caring for your parents.
Right.
And oftentimes couples in the sandwich generation don't think to sit and have these money conversations, which again are really life conversation. What are our values? What is it we want to do with our parents and in-laws? And how does that impact other aspects of our life? Because, Stephen, if you think about a caregiver who steps back potentially from their current job, that doesn't just impact current income. It could also impact the couple's retirement income.
Right.
So these conversations are really important.
Right. And let's face it, in-laws can be a whole issue on its own, even when you're not talking about money, but then you throw the money aspect into it as well.
In-laws can be outlaws, is what I sometimes say. So, it's different in every family, how they see their own parents and their spouse's parents and how those relationships go. So these are touchy conversations.
One thing you see frequently now, especially with the cost of housing, is people giving their inheritances sooner in life, and that might have an impact on them in the longer term. How do you even have a conversation about something like that? It's just another whole level of complexity.
It's a tricky one. If you think about this from both people's standpoint, you have generation one, the older generation, wanting to give this money now to help people earlier, as you said. And you have generation two who may need that money. So you can see where this is tricky. But here's the part that people don't often think about, and it's the longevity aspect of this.
Right.
And the longevity aspect is generation one may not be thinking about their own needs if they live a long time. And this is pretty new, right? That we have people living to be so old. Right. So how do they talk about this? And I would say, if you're the sandwich generation, you want to look at this realistically and think about how do you approach, could be your parents or your in-laws, in a space of gratitude for wanting this, but also having conversations that are realistic about, we don't want to set you up to not be prepared for your later years.
Right.
And of course, generation two can end up paying for some of that if this isn't thought about ahead of time.
Yeah.
And generation one doesn't have to share all their information about money and are they okay, but they could have a conversation about, yes, let's talk about that realistically and what you might need, mom, dad, and make sure you're okay before we start taking this money. And if we take this money now, knowing you may not be okay, what are we agreeing to do in the future? So I think it's coming from a space of gratitude and empathy.
Right. So the conversation extends outside of the couple to other people affected.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think what you just said there, Stephen, is true anyway. Often our money conversations as couples do resonate out to other people in our family, like our parents or in-laws or our kids. So right. Yes, this is one of those conversations that needs to include the parents or the in-laws.
Okay. You've already touched on a lot of the different ways that money is an integral part of people's lives. So clearly you need to talk about it. It's an important conversation that you need to have. What are some of the strategies for handling those conversations, for having better ones right from the get-go? And I guess, does it start early in a relationship? Is it something that people should be talking about pretty soon in?
Ideally, I think that's true. And I often say money conversations, like many others, are not a one-and-done conversation.
Right.
A good conversation, a small one done well, can open up the door for easier ongoing conversations. So people want to think of their approach in doing this and think about what is it they want to talk about. And I think one of the best early conversations people can have is to discuss their own beliefs about money. Where did they get those from? What was money like growing up? Is right. A really great question.
Right.
Everybody has a different relationship with money, and often that comes from our experience as kids.
Sure.
And if you had parents who were very stressed about money all the time, you take something away from that, right? If you had parents who said, never, ever spend more than you make, don't ever have debt, and you happen to have a spouse who didn't get that messaging and looks at debt as something that isn't such a bad thing. Mm-hmm. I get the opportunity to do workshops on this topic for women. There's a workshop I do called Women, Wealth, and Wisdom. And in that, I ask that question in the group and have people talk about it. Oh, yeah. It's fascinating to hear what people say. What are the messages you got from your parents around money? And I often share my money story, which was parents who didn't have a good relationship around money. It was very stressful. Mm-hmm. And how that impacted me and how I then managed money throughout my life. That's something that I only learned by some self-reflection and somebody asking me those questions. So if, you're listening to this and you think, I've never thought about that, most people haven't. So understanding early messages I think are key. And then the next part to that, Stephen, that I think is thinking about what are your life goals and having a real conversation about what is it we as a couple agree to as life goals. And the beauty of those conversations is they form a foundation that you can come back to. So you can say, hey, have our life goals changed? This is why I'm a big believer that we have, regular ongoing conversations about money so that you can keep coming back to how are things from where they were the last time? What's changed? What do we want to do differently? Because as we go through life, our thoughts about all of this change as our circumstances change.
Right. So it's partly about planning, but I guess it just starts because in a couple you would have a conversation about your life's ambitions and how you see your life progressing and so on. But you need to build in the how do we get there, i.e. through money from the outset.
I agree with you. And I would say, too, as you move into middle age, people start to look at later life stages, too, right? So you have to think about health, longevity, conversations that I can tell you in my experience, couples often never have about, are we making sure that we're setting ourselves up to have the later years that we want to have, not just from the retirement and how much do we want to travel, but have we taken care of ourselves through the times in our lives that may be challenging from a health standpoint?
It's a hard thing to do. I mean, if you're starting a relationship or getting married in your 30s, nobody's really thinking about, so what are we going to do when we retire or if our parents get sick? Like, it's just not a conversation most people are having. But would you encourage them to be planning in that much detail around their lives? Is that even realistic?
I don't think that's realistic, but I'll tell you what I do think is realistic is, and I want to just step back and say for a second that when I see people have those conversations, it's often when their parents need care, that will kick in. Hey, we don't want this to happen to us. I've heard that said so many times. So we better think about this. But we can do that in a more proactive way and less reactive way. And I agree with you. When you're in your 30s, probably your thoughts about money are more about perhaps starting to think about retirement, but it may be what's in front of you. Might be the house, maybe the kids' education. Yeah.
Whatever.
But if you start those conversations and you let your money conversations grow with your life stage, you will eventually have those health and longevity conversations.
Right. So you're building a foundation early on in which you can have those conversations so that as new life cycles come along, you're in a good place to be able to continue to have them.
Yeah. And what I see, the approach to these conversations is so key, right? So, and I will say that if we do money conversations well as a couple, that tends to spill over into other important life conversations we need to have. And when I mean the approach, I mean the idea of being curious with your spouse or partner versus judgmental. We often have a lot of judgment around money. Yeah. And on the flip side, people often have a lot of shame around money. So if you're approaching your spouse in a judgmental way, it may kick off the shame and then the conversations devolve. It's not a good thing. So I think that idea of curiosity and openness and really exploring to understand who your spouse or partner is around money, because you said it beautifully before. We don't have these conversations very often. So for most of us, we've never talked about this.
Just to get back to a point you were talking about where people have, even from the way they were raised, different conceptions of money or different feelings about money and how it's to be managed, or they might just come from different economic backgrounds. One of the spouse's parents was not well off, the other one was. How do you reconcile those different backgrounds and different approaches?
And some of this is in creating a safe space where you can really talk about this and trying to find the middle ground. So it's not imposing your values and beliefs on your spouse, being open about yours, being open about your spouse's, and trying to find a middle ground. And for lots of people, they can't do that alone. And that's where a financial advisor can be a huge help. Financial advisors have these conversations with couples a lot. And the beauty is that they're a neutral third party. They don't have that emotional connection. And if that is an avenue that doesn't work, there are now life coaches that specialize in this field. There are therapists who specialize in this. And it doesn't mean that somehow you and your spouse have failed if you need to bring in a third party. It may be the best way to have these conversations because there's so much emotion around money, and the third party can help find that middle ground with you.
And how do you handle disagreements about it? Because can start to have those conversations. Hopefully they end up in a good place. If they don't see eye to eye, how do you manage those types of differences of opinion?
There's no magic formula for this, right? So when we talk about interest versus position is something that I always come back to when I'm working with people, which is your interest is what you say you want, and your position is why you want it.
Okay.
And where you tend to find agreement is at the position level versus the interest level. So, when you move down to why I want this is because, I want us to have security as a family. I want us to have experiences that are fun, and that's why I want to talk about this vacation. It changes everything when you move to the position level. So you have to move from what it is to why you want it. And by the way, that's not a magic formula, but that's from the Harvard Negotiation Project. So it's got some pretty good research behind it. But it does make a big difference in helping couples get to more agreement when they move to that. And then again, I would say, if you're really struggling, think about a third party. It's not all expensive to do that, right? A lot of it is available to everyone, but it isn't a failure to need to bring someone else into that conversation if you have to do that.
Right. Position versus interest. That's an interesting starting point for the conversation.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that people can do that can help when they're in disagreement is to pause, to step away, to take a break. When emotion gets high, it's hard sometimes to listen. And we're talking about listening deeply here. And if your emotion is taking over, it may be a time to just call a timeout and say, how about we come back to this tomorrow, the next day? The word of caution I have about that is you want to make sure you come back to it. Don't use that as a conversation avoidance technique, but it can be very, very useful. And you could say, let's both go away and think about this in this way, hear each other, and come back tomorrow and see if we can talk about this differently.
Sounds like an approach you could take to any kind of disagreement
That's
in
what
a
I'm
couple,
saying,
and
all
not
of
just
this.
not just a money disagreement. Right.
It all flows. Doing this well, it'll help in every disagreement you have as a couple.
Right. Okay.
Not that I have any experience in this, of course. But
Oh, of course. Me neither. I think it's not uncommon. I don't know. Maybe this is just a stereotype that there's often one person in a relationship who handles most of the financial issues. Is that the case in your experience? And if so, is that okay? If one person's less interested, let the person who is interested do it.
So I like to divide up the conversations about money in three ways: day-to-day finances. So, it's the budgeting, the inflow, the outflow of money. And then think about investments, the more longer term.
Yeah.
And then estate planning. So when we talk about does one person often do it, what I hear a lot of times in couples is one person's managing the day-to-day, and that may be the woman who's doing that.
Right. And
the man's more likely to be managing the investments. So we know that women are less confident about managing investments than men. Mm-hmm. And when I say this to women, I always say, notice the word was confident, not competent, because that's key, right? Yeah. So when you think about that and the division, does it matter? The thing that matters is everybody needs to be aware of what's going on. Mm-hmm. And this is where it can become a problem. So and we're going to stereotype here and say the woman's not engaged very much in the investment conversations.
Right.
That's a problem if there's no awareness and no input. Because remember what we've just said, that life and money go hand in hand. So you really can't go off and be running the money without having life conversations, which is why couples can do this together. And I think part of why women historically have not engaged in the money conversation is we haven't brought these two together and said, really, we have to talk about our lives and what we want, and then we can talk about how to get there.
Right.
So I know so many stories around this. I just want to share one with you about a woman I knew. This couple were in their 50s. They divided money tasks. She did day-to-day. He was doing the investing. He actually wanted her to be more engaged. She said, you're doing a great job. She'd do kind of a cursory look, but didn't really know too much what was going on. And then he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And they were fortunate in that he lived 5 healthy years. But she realized she was going to have to take over all the money eventually. Yeah. And so she did. And she found that she enjoyed it and she was good at it. And after he passed, she and I had a conversation, and she said to me, I am so glad I did this before he died, because grieving is exhausting. And if I now had to figure all this out, this would be horrible in the midst of grieving. And so I always say to people, you don't want life to push you into having to have these conversations to learn about things. This is why, as a couple, you need to be having regular conversations. Just make sure, does everybody know where the bank accounts are? I hear stories about people having a spouse die and having to go figure out where are their accounts, and I don't even know how to access these accounts. So getting good financial advice about should you have these accounts joint, how much money needs to come together and separate, all those things need to be considered as couples.
And just to be clear, probably things have changed, I would imagine. I mean, people are getting married later. This idea that women would not have handled money is probably a pretty ancient idea anyway. So it's probably less of an issue than it would have been in the past, do you think?
I do think that, but I also think what happens is when two people are working, you've got kids, it's easy to start dividing household tasks. Right. So when couples first get married, sometimes I don't know about you, but I'll be in the grocery store and I'll see these happy young couples together grocery shopping. 3 years later, there's a kid and one of them's home, the other one's grocery shopping. We divide tasks and we start dividing money tasks. So it's not a competence issue again. Sometimes it's a practical issue of we've got too much to deal with as a couple. You do this, I'll do this. That's okay if that works for you, as long as it doesn't mean one person is not aware and is not involved in the decision making.
Okay, so transparency. Openness.
Yeah, and recognizing that those decisions that are being made about money involve your life goals.
Right. And if a couple is just starting to live together, we're not maybe necessarily even talking about a marriage situation, does that same guidance apply to people in that situation?
Well, I think there are lots of conversations people need to have, whether they're just living together or married, because people sharing a household have joint expenses, have maybe different approaches. And here's a great one, Stephen, that makes me kind of smile thinking about this. But imagine you move in with somebody who grew up in a family where the minute you left a room, you turned off the lights and you kept the heat really low. And you move in with somebody who's got the lights on all the time and the heat up. It drives each other crazy. Right? People don't think to talk about these things, but that's the kind of practical application of what we learned growing up and how we tend to approach our lives that impact money and the conversations we need to have.
Right. Or even something as simple as how much you're going to eat out. I guess there could be lots of things that would
set off disagreements.
So there's conversations, and you don't have to have them all at once. I think that's something we want to say to people. That's why if you set up that let's talk about this, let's maybe set a regular time that we just come back and say, is there anything we need to talk about? I know that's not a typical way people operate, but I know that people who do that tend to have less friction around money because they've made it part of how they operate as a couple.
Right. And is there anything you should never say to your spouse about money or your partner?
I think it's the shaming things that we have to be careful about, right?
Like, why did you buy that?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. If you look in couples, typically we all spend money on what we think is important. Right. And that often is different. That's why you need the shared, here's our goals. And one of the things that you can talk about is how much money do we each have discretion over? Right. That can be a great conversation. So then when those new shoes come in the house, it can be, hey, that's my discretionary money, right? But that's one of the reasons people need to think about, do you have some money that's just yours and what's the limit on that and all those kind of conversations.
And a budget, basically.
And a budget. Yeah. It's about, what we want is to have a healthy relationship with money. We want to be able to, when we spend money, feel like it's okay and we're taking care of the future at the same time. And that's a balancing act. And it's not something that's just innate in a couple to be able to do. You have to really figure that out together.
I feel like a big takeaway as we're wrapping up here is that sometimes when people are talking about money, it's not really about money. It's about other things.
Yeah. Oftentimes money is about power and control.
Right. Yeah.
And that's why this is such a fraught conversation. And I think what happens, because it does have these overlays, is it's easy to avoid it. But avoiding it makes it worse. So I often say you can postpone things. You can't avoid them ultimately. And what happens is when you postpone, often it gets more fraught and more difficult to have the conversation. So, if you're hearing this podcast, you're thinking, I've never talked to my spouse, but things are okay now. Great. Start having conversations around money.
Amy, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Always great to have you on.
Pleasure, Stephen. Thank you.
I've been speaking with life transition expert, coach, and consultant for Scotiabank and the Scotiabank Women Initiative, Dr. Amy Dupree. There's a lot to consider when planning for your future. Discover Scotia Wealth Management's total wealth planning process and how it can benefit you. Learn more at scotiawealthmanagement.com. The Perspectives podcast is made by me, Stephen Maurice, as well as Armina Lagaya and our producer, Andrew Norton. For a transcript of this episode, as well as other stories, insights, analysis, and thought leadership, visit our website, scotiabank.com/perspectives. We'll see you next time.